The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The moment the first words were spoken, it was clear this wasn't going to be a polite debate or a scripted political exchange. This was going to be a reckoning. Every sentence delivered was razor sharp, cutting through the noise and directly into the heart of the matter. There was no room for deflection, no space for political maneuvering, only cold, hard facts laid out for the world to see. The exposure began with precision, a methodical breakdown that left little room for escape. A timeline of past statements, policies, and contradictions were brought to light, each one unraveling the carefully crafted public image that had been maintained for so long. The audience watched in real time as the inconsistencies piled up, forming a narrative that couldn't be denied. It wasn't about opinion or spin. This was about reality versus rhetoric. As one point after another was laid bare, the weight of the truth became undeniable. There had been claims of unwavering dedication to key issues, yet the facts painted a different story. Legislative records, public remarks, and past affiliations contradicted the carefully rehearsed persona that had been presented to the public. It was a stark contrast, and the room could feel the shift happening as realization dawned on those watching. The intensity of the moment only grew as more details surfaced. The facts weren't just inconvenient, they were damning. There had been attempts to control the narrative, to shape public perception through calculated messaging, but none of that could withstand the sheer force of documented reality. The words spoken in the past came back, played side by side with the actions taken, exposing a gap so wide it couldn't be ignored. A sense of unease settled in, even among those who had once been staunch defenders. Eyes darted around the room, searching for a way to rationalize what was happening, but there was none. The truth, laid out so plainly, was impossible to refute. And when the facts were indisputable, the usual tactics of deflection and outrage lost their effectiveness. What made this moment even more powerful was the calm, unwavering delivery. There was no need for dramatics, no need for exaggerated rhetoric, just a steady, relentless presentation of the truth. That was enough. In fact, it was more than enough. The weight of the revelation spoke louder than any grandstanding ever could. The contradictions weren't minor, and they weren't accidental. They were fundamental, cutting to the very core of the credibility that had been carefully built up over time. It wasn't just one misstep or a single moment of hypocrisy. It was a pattern that, when pieced together, revealed a reality far different from the image that had been projected. As the exposure continued, there were clear signs of discomfort. The typical confident posture started to fade, replaced by defensive gestures, arms crossing, eyes darting downward, nervous glances toward aides or allies. The body language was a dead giveaway. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a catastrophe unfolding in real time. Every attempt to push back was met with an unshakable wall of facts. The record was clear. The words had been spoken. The actions had been taken, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Even those in the audience who had initially dismissed the confrontation as political theater found themselves leaning forward, captivated by the sheer undeniability of what was being laid out before them. These weren't vague accusations. These weren't partisan attacks. These were verifiable, indisputable truths that no amount of spin could erase. The frustration was visible. The once polished demeanor was starting to crack. Interruptions became more frequent, attempts to steer the conversation elsewhere more desperate. But none of it worked. The facts kept coming, relentless and unforgiving. There was a moment when the weight of it all seemed to settle in fully. A shift in expression, a flicker of recognition that the narrative was no longer under control. The realization that this wasn't just another debate, another chance to dance around the issues and come out unscathed. This was something different. This was exposure at its most brutal, and there was no easy way out. The audience reaction was telling. Silence, murmurs, a few audible gasps as the most damning revelations were laid out. It wasn't just those. On the opposing side reacting, this was hitting home for everyone. Even those who had come in as firm supporters were left grappling with what they were seeing unfold before them. The confidence that had once been unshakable was now nowhere, to be found. Instead, there was a visible struggle to maintain composure, to find a response that wouldn't make things worse. But there wasn't one. Not when the truth was this clear, this overwhelming. There were attempts to shift blame, to turn the focus elsewhere, but none of it landed. The facts remained, standing firm against every weak defense thrown at them. The more the excuses were made, the more obvious it became that there was no legitimate counter-argument. This wasn't just a tough moment in a political career. This was the kind of exposure that left lasting damage, the kind that couldn't simply be brushed aside with a well-crafted statement the next day, the kind that forced people to reconsider everything they thought they knew. And as the final points were made, as the last contradictions were laid bare, there was no doubt left in anyone's mind. The truth had spoken, and it had spoken loudly. The unraveling of a public career doesn't happen in an instant. It happens in stages, first with small cracks in the foundation, then with undeniable contradictions, and finally, with a moment so devastating that recovery seems impossible. This was one of those moments. The weight of undeniable facts had already begun to settle, and as the discussion continued, it became clear that this was more than just a difficult day. This was a reckoning, one that threatened to bring everything crashing down. At first, there was resistance, a desperate attempt to maintain composure and dismiss the scrutiny as nothing more than political theater. The usual lines were rehearsed, the same defenses repeated, but they lacked conviction. The problem wasn't just the accusations being made, it was that the evidence was irrefutable. The responses felt hollow, disconnected from reality, as if the sheer force of repetition could somehow erase the glaring inconsistencies. But the audience wasn't buying it. For years, there had been an image of strength, of competence, of unwavering conviction. Supporters had been led to believe that they were standing behind someone who represented their values, their interests, their voice in the larger political landscape. But now, those same supporters were watching something they couldn't ignore. The carefully crafted narrative was being dismantled in real time, piece by piece, and the person at the center of it all was struggling to keep up. As the contradictions continued to mount, frustration became evident. The once confident posture began to shift, arms crossed tightly, fingers tapping anxiously, eyes darting across the room, searching for an escape. Each attempt to counter the facts only made things worse. There was no well-reasoned argument, no compelling justification, just vague dismissals and half-hearted attempts to shift the conversation elsewhere. But that wasn't going to work this time. People had heard the promises. They had believed the rhetoric. They had placed their trust in the person standing before them. And now, they were realizing that much of what they had been told didn't hold up under scrutiny. The reaction in the room was unmistakable. Murmurs of disbelief, the occasional shaking of a head, the quiet but telling movement of individuals who had once been loyal supporters now leaning back in their chairs, arms folded, no longer nodding in agreement. It was more than just an uncomfortable moment. It was a career-altering shift. The damage wasn't just coming from political opponents, it was happening among those who had once stood firmly in support. The exposure had cut so deeply that even those who wanted to defend what was happening struggled to find the words. There was no spin capable of undoing what was unfolding. An attempt was made to regain control of the conversation, to inject emotion into the response, to turn the tables by playing the victim. The argument was simple. This wasn't about accountability. It was an attack, an attempt to tear someone down for political gain. But the problem was, the facts didn't support that narrative. The contradictions weren't fabrications. The policy failures weren't exaggerations. The hypocrisy wasn't a matter of interpretation. It was all real. And it was all being laid out with such clarity that no amount of deflection could change it. Even the most loyal allies seemed hesitant. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others whispered to one another, likely discussing the severity of what they were witnessing. The energy in the room had changed. The confidence that had once been projected so effortlessly was now fading, replaced by a noticeable uncertainty. This wasn't the reaction that had been expected. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. With every failed attempt to redirect the conversation, frustration turned to anger. The responses became sharper, defensive, almost desperate. There were accusations, claims that this was an orchestrated attack, that the real issues were being ignored. But it was too late for that. The truth was out, and no amount of outrage could erase it. The frustration wasn't just coming from the one being exposed, it was also growing among those watching. There were no real answers, no accountability, just repeated attempts to change the subject. It was a classic political move, one that had worked in the past, but this time it fell flat. The audience wasn't willing to accept vague responses anymore. They wanted real answers, and they weren't getting them. Then came the moment of silence, the kind that only happens when something truly significant has taken place. It was as if, for a brief second, everyone in the room realized exactly what was happening. This wasn't just another political skirmish. This was the kind of exposure that people would remember. This was the kind of moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and discussed long after the cameras stopped rolling. Supporters who had once cheered without hesitation now hesitated before clapping. Some didn't clap at all. Others sat quietly, processing everything they had just seen. The shift was undeniable. This wasn't just about losing an argument. It was about losing trust, credibility, and the ability to command the unwavering support that had once seemed guaranteed. The cracks in the foundation had widened, and it was no longer a question of whether damage had been done. It was a question of how much. Even if this moment could be spun in the media, even if talking points could be crafted and damage control strategies put in place, the reality remained. The people who had once believed, who had once defended every decision without question, were now questioning everything. It was impossible to ignore the impact of what had just happened. Some in the room still tried to rationalize it, to convince themselves that this was just a rough patch, that it could all be repaired. But deep down, they knew. Something fundamental. The moment began with a calm but deliberate tone, the kind that signaled something significant was about to unfold. There were no theatrics, no over-the-top accusations, just a steady, unshakable presentation of facts that would leave no room for denial. It wasn't about political spin or personal attacks. It was about truth, laid bare for everyone to see. The first point struck like a hammer, a simple statement backed by undeniable evidence. The words spoken in the past were revisited, not in an abstract way, but in their exact form. The contrast between what had been claimed and what had actually occurred was stunning. The reaction in the room was immediate. Some shifted in their seats, others leaned forward, realizing they were about to witness something that couldn't be ignored. A clear timeline was established. The promises made, the commitments declared, with unwavering certainty, and then the actions, or in some cases, the complete lack of them. It was a pattern that stretched over years, not a singular misstep or isolated mistake, but a continuous discrepancy between words and reality. Legislative. Records were cited with precision. No speculation, no broad claims, just documented votes, public statements, and key decisions that stood in stark contrast to the public image carefully curated over time. The response was predictable at first, an attempt to brush it off, to dismiss it as selective framing. But that argument crumbled quickly when the next piece of evidence was introduced. There was no way to argue against it. The contradictions were so blatant that even those who wanted to defend them found themselves at a loss. The body language in the room shifted. Some crossed their arms, others tapped their fingers on the table, a few exchanged knowing glances. They had heard the speeches before, the grand declarations of principle, but now they were seeing proof that much of it had been nothing more than carefully crafted rhetoric. Then came the financial records, documents showing exactly where support had been placed, who had benefited, and how actions behind the scenes didn't align with the carefully controlled public statements. The shock was evident. It wasn't just about hypocrisy, it was about direct deception. The people who had trusted, who had believed, were now forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. There had been attempts to present a narrative of unwavering commitment to certain causes, of fighting for the people rather than special interests. But the facts said otherwise. Donations, endorsements, and quiet alliances revealed an entirely different picture. Not just once, not just in a single instance, but over and over again, forming an undeniable pattern. The reaction was fascinating to watch. Some in the audience tried to mask their disbelief, others openly frowned, and a few whispered among themselves. These weren't political enemies reacting. These were the very people who had once been supporters, who had defended every action without question. And now they were struggling to process what they were hearing. Each revelation built upon the last. The attempts to respond became weaker, the once confident voice now tinged with uncertainty. It wasn't just about facing opposition. It was about realizing that even those who had once stood firmly in support were now having doubts. The contradictions kept coming. Video clips were played, statements were compared, and the disparity between words and actions grew wider with each passing moment. The frustration became visible, not just from the person at the center of the exposure, but from those who had once defended them. A moment came when the weight of it all seemed to truly sink in. The usual deflection tactics weren't working. There was no way to redirect the conversation, no way to spin the facts in a favorable light. The reality was too clear, too overwhelming. Supporters who had once cheered every speech, who had repeated the talking points with certainty, now sat in silence. Some folded their arms tightly, others shook their heads. It was clear that something had changed. This wasn't just about a bad moment. It was about a fundamental loss of trust. As the IR exposure continued, frustration gave way to defensiveness. There was an attempt to claim bias, to argue that this was nothing more than a personal attack. But that argument held no weight when the only thing being presented was the truth. No opinions, no exaggerations, just facts, carefully laid out, piece by piece. Even the most loyal defenders struggled to find counter-arguments. The response was disjointed, unfocused, filled with vague generalities rather than direct answers. It wasn't just the facts that were damaging, it was the inability to respond to them in a way that made sense. The crowd reaction said it all. There were no outbursts, no immediate rush to defense. Instead, there was hesitation, uncertainty, a collective realization that something wasn't adding up. Even those who wanted to believe in the narrative being pushed found themselves questioning. A few brave voices from the audience spoke up, asking direct questions. The answers were unconvincing. The usual confidence had faded, replaced by a clear struggle to maintain control of the conversation. It was at that moment that the severity of the situation became undeniable. It wasn't just about facing criticism, it was about losing credibility. In real time. The foundation that had once seemed so unshakable was now crumbling under the weight of undeniable facts. The audience reaction would determine the future. And judging by the faces in the room, by the silence where there had once been applause, by the uncertainty where there had once been confidence, it was clear that things had changed. The truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back from it. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence as the tide of discussion shifted. There had been moments of tension earlier, but now the atmosphere had thickened with a distinct sense of anticipation. What was once a carefully crafted image was now beginning to unravel in front of everyone's eyes. The conversation had moved beyond casual critique or political differences. It had entered the realm of deeper, more uncomfortable truths. And the audience was beginning to realize that this wasn't just about a bad moment, it was about a complete loss of credibility. What had once seemed like small cracks in the foundation were now wide enough to expose the full extent of the situation. The questions being asked were not only about the surface-level inconsistencies, but were delving into the very core of the narrative that had been spun so masterfully over the years. It wasn't just about hypocrisy anymore. It was about direct, undeniable contradictions, statements that, when compared to actions, were not only misleading, but in some cases outright deceptive. The defensiveness was palpable. What began as a calm response soon escalated into sharp words and increasingly erratic justifications. Each answer seemed to dig a deeper hole, as though the person at the center of the scrutiny was realizing, perhaps too late, that the truth couldn't be controlled or spun away. With every response, the weight of the situation became more evident, not just on the individual being questioned, but also on the supporters who had once cheered every word spoken by this figure. What was most striking about this moment, however, was the complete collapse of the carefully constructed defense mechanisms that had always been relied upon. It wasn't that there hadn't been attempts to deflect, to shift the blame, or to rewrite history in real time. It was that these defenses no longer held any weight. They were dismissed as unconvincing and, worse yet, as attempts to dodge responsibility. There was no longer any room for evasion. The facts had been presented, and they could not be ignored. The most striking part of the exchange was the shift in the room itself. What had once been an audience full of support, applause, and nods of agreement began to change in real time. The eyes that had once been full of admiration now contained skepticism, confusion, and in some cases, disappointment. It was as though the audience could no longer reconcile what they had believed with the reality that was unfolding before them. The tension that had been building from the beginning of the conversation now manifested in a collective realization that this was not going to end in the way they had expected. What followed was a moment of pure frustration. It wasn't just about defending a single point. It was about defending a legacy, a carefully curated public persona that was now crumbling. The more the contradictions were exposed, the more defensive the responses became. The anger was no longer just about being called out on specific issues. It had grown into something much more profound, a desperate attempt to salvage the pieces of a career that now seemed irreparably damaged. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a few choice words. This was an unmasking of years of decisions, public statements, and political maneuvering that had been portrayed as virtuous, but were now revealed for what they truly were: self-serving, opportunistic, and hypocritical. The more the facts were presented, the clearer it became that the truth had always been just beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. It wasn't just the accusations that carried weight, it was the overwhelming evidence supporting them. Legislative records, financial backers, private meetings, and public contradictions were all laid bare. The ability to deny the truth was fading fast, and with it, the carefully cultivated aura of invincibility. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force, a political figure who could do no wrong, now looked exposed and vulnerable. What made the situation even more complex was the realization that this wasn't just a personal failure. It was a failure that extended to those who had supported and enabled the individual at the center of it all. The room, once full of fervent applause, now contained a significant number of individuals who were deeply uncomfortable. The faces that had once shown unwavering support were now filled with uncertainty, some even visibly embarrassed by the revelations. The most revealing part of the exchange, though, was the shift in strategy. The defense began to shift from reasoned arguments to emotional appeals. The idea that this was an orchestrated attack began to emerge, but even that narrative was quickly dismantled by the steady flow of facts. The emotions in the room were no longer on the side of the individual being exposed. They had shifted to those who had been misled, to those who had invested their trust and energy into a narrative that was now falling apart. The change in tone was unmistakable. What had started as a calm, composed series of defenses became a frenzy of emotion. It was as if the person at the center of it all was grasping for anything that might restore the semblance of control, anything that might reestablish the connection with the audience that had been lost. But it was clear that this was a lost cause. The room had moved on. The revelations were too profound, too damaging, to be undone by emotion alone. This wasn't just about facts anymore. It was about something much deeper: the loss of trust. Trust that had been built up over years, and trust that now seemed irreparably broken. It wasn't just that people were now aware of the contradictions, it was that they now knew they had been lied to. The disappointment was as much about the betrayal as it was about the facts. The public had placed their faith in someone who, it turned out, wasn't who they appeared to be. It became clear that the damage done was not just to the individual at the center of the scrutiny, but to the entire political landscape that had supported them. The lies, the deception, and the hypocrisy had now infected the trust that had once been so firmly placed in a single individual. The shift in the room was not just a reflection of disillusionment, it was a reflection of a larger realization that the system itself had allowed this to happen, and now it was paying the price. No matter how many times the narrative was adjusted, no matter how many times the story was spun to make it seem like this was just another partisan attack, the truth had already set in. The audience, once captivated by the rhetoric and promises, was now faced with the uncomfortable task of confronting the reality. There was no escaping it. The reality of the situation could no longer be ignored. What had once seemed like an unshakable narrative, carefully crafted and maintained over time, had come apart in a matter of moments. The carefully constructed public image had been exposed, as little more than a facade, revealing the truth beneath, a story of contradictions, deception, and lost trust. What was once a figure of strength and certainty now stood vulnerable, stripped of the very credibility that had once made them untouchable. In moments like these, the audience's reaction becomes the ultimate measure of a legacy. What had been a room filled with admiration now contained faces marked by skepticism, disappointment, and, in some cases, betrayal. The shift was not just in opinion, it was in the very fabric of the narrative that had been spun for so long. The unmasking of the truth left no room for denial or rationalization. Trust, once given freely, was now shattered. It wasn't just that people had been proven wrong in their support, it was that they had been misled. The emotional weight of that realization cannot be understated. When the truth is laid bare, it's not just the person at the center of the storm who suffers the consequences. The ripple effect extends far beyond them, touching everyone who had invested in their story. In the aftermath, the question becomes not just about what went wrong, but how to move forward. Once trust is broken, it's never easy to rebuild. The damage is done. The consequences of this exposure will be felt long after the initial shock fades. People's perceptions will change, and a reputation, once tarnished, is hard to restore. But perhaps the most powerful lesson in all of this is the importance of truth. In a world where public images are carefully curated and narratives are shaped to fit agendas, the truth stands as the only real constant. It may take time, but eventually, the truth will always come to light. And when it does, no amount of spin or deflection can keep it hidden. The events that unfolded serve as a reminder to all those in positions of influence that the truth is always more powerful than any crafted image. Integrity, honesty, and transparency are the foundation of lasting trust. Without them, even the most carefully constructed narratives will eventually crumble, and when that happens, all that is left is the reality of what lies beneath.